confessing that it's a real pleasure for me to contribute to this refresher series, not only because its theme, that is social and cultural change in India, is extremely interesting for me, but also because I value the growth of online learning materials to which the teaching learning center of Ramanujan College is also contributing. And I really heartily congratulate the history department and the TLC at Ramanujan College for this uh, arrangement. Now, the topic of my talk is society and culture in a North Indian village, approximately 1780 to 2020, accessing commoners' histories through fieldwork. The village that I'm going to talk about is called Dhantala and is located in Meerut district of Western Uttar Pradesh. What do I mean by social and cultural change in the village? Actually, the terms social and cultural change have not only been used in diverse ways by scholars, but also there are many overlaps between these categories. For example, sometimes we study patriarchy as part of culture and sometimes as part of social structure. Similarly, daily life, education, there is an element of imprecision about such usages. So I'll begin by first clarifying what exactly I mean by social structure and by culture. By the former, I am referring to the varieties of groupings in a society, both emic or those which are familiar to the subjects studied by us, and also ethic groupings which are based on some shared attribute considered important from the researcher's perspective. The former, for example, would include caste, gotra, and the latter would include class, subaltern, etc. So, the study of such social structure would include the study of relations between these various groupings and also the long term mapping of changes in such structures. Similarly, by the term culture, I'm especially referring to the subtle realm of shared mentalities or widely held beliefs, values, loyalties, emotion patterns in communities, which are undoubtedly very difficult to map, especially at the community level, but they can be broadly gauged, especially by contrasting various regions and nationalities, etc. For example, the moment we discuss the marital relations between Germans and North Indians, the contrasts stand out very clearly. So, in comparative light, these cultural differences can be gauged. And this is what I see as the core of culture. But these shared mentalities and also behavior patterns, shared behavior patterns in a community, like how people eat, what time do they sleep, what kind of apparel they wear, what does it signify about their values, etc. These are all shaped by a number of cultural institutions in conjunction. These institutions include religious systems, folklore, socialization patterns in the community, and in more modern terms, education system, modern ideologies and political activity, and especially media, various types of media channels. All these shape mentalities and behavior patterns directly. Uh, although the same are also affected or molded by indirectly by the geography of a region, the historical memories of a region, etc. So this is what I mean by culture. Now, obviously, I won't be able to cover the entire spectrum of social structure or of culture, and rather select some, especially under social structure. I would be talking about the changing class relations and hierarchy in Dhantala since 1780 roughly. And in culture, I'll be talking more about the changing political consciousness in the village from late 18th century to early 21st century. Now, before I proceed for discussing these issues, I would also confess my ideological bias, since its subconscious influence on my not only analysis but choice of uh, facts, evidence, etc., cannot be ruled out. I happen to have a liberal bent in contrast to the nationalist or the socialist political leaning. And uh, I must also now clarify why I chose Dhantala for my research work. Actually, this was a fallout of my study of a slum in my neighborhood in Delhi, which had some migrants from this village. As I was completing my MPhil dissertation, I became very curious about rural life and luckily got help from these immigrants into the slum uh, that I was studying. And that's how I landed in Dhantala in 1989. Now, talking about the broader trends in social and cultural histories in India, no doubt we can note a real bloom of caste studies, gender studies, life histories, subaltern studies, studies of discourses, etc., which really make the field extremely fascinating for students of history today. Not only has this uh, field blossomed significantly in recent decades, but also the traditional concerns of historians, like, for example, political history, administrative history, or economic history, have been explained with reference increasingly to cultural factors and social structural factors. This is a very notable and rich enhancement of the field. However, on the negative side, there are two tendencies which are often visible, which give some dismay. And this includes one, a lack of long term comparative synthesis of the field. Instead, we have lots of uh, intensive explorations of specific events or a court case, for example, or someone's letters, etc. Secondly, we unfortunately see a lot of repetition of ideologically correct uh, readings of events. For example, in many gender study papers or subaltern study papers, there is a tendency to repeat the coexistence of, for example, resistance and hegemony in subaltern consciousness, just to give one example. In order to uh, address these problems, obviously, at one level, we need to relate micro studies with other micro studies, which may be the rich secondary literature in the field, and thereby come at some long-term perspectives on change, especially in studied caste, in gender relations, in consciousness, etc., for example. And secondly, we need to, I would say, combine fieldwork along with archival work, especially for the colonial era and contemporary histories, uh, since a lot of local records, kacheri records, private papers, family uh, documents, also the bhats, vanshavalis, and court papers, etc., are easily available, and these can be also combined with interviews, group discussions, elders recall, and even quantitative surveys, etc., in the field. A very important bonus of combining fieldwork with archival work is the uh, sur- surfeit of evidence that we get in altogether new fields. For example, private life. We can build histories of private life, of changing family relations, of mentalities, etc., which are very difficult to build on a long term basis from just archival records. This raises a very important question. Why has fieldwork not been combined, at least for the modern era, by historians uh, to the extent that is possible? Although we have some now historians combining fieldwork with archival work, some of the partition histories stand tall in this field. But the full potential of this combination of fieldwork and archival work has not been done clearly in India. And there are perhaps two reasons for this. One, there is some methodological skepticism about oral histories and oral evidence, etc., which is actually puerile because I said fieldwork also brings us face to face with a lot of new documentary evidence. It is not just oral evidence that we tap. And combining oral evidence with documentary evidence from fieldwork is surely gives us a bonanza of new insights and perspectives. But there is therefore another reason, perhaps, which is actually quite worrisome, why lots of historians of the modern era are not taking recourse to fieldwork. And that seems to be that fieldwork hits hard at ideological presumptions that are unfortunately valued excessively by some scholars. Uh, Hopefully, in future, we will have more work combining these two sources of evidence. Uh, as I said, social and cultural change has a large spectrum, and I am particularly going to focus on changing class relations and changing political consciousness in Dhantala over the past 2.5 centuries. Once, I hope I am very clearly audible.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Now, let's begin. Before I go into the social and cultural history of Dhantala, let's begin with understanding the layout and the location of the village. The village, as I said, is situated in Meerut district. It is 80 kilometers east of Delhi and 20 kilometers west of Meerut city. It's spread over about 1,500 acres, of which 1,300 acres are fields, about 100 acres are three ponds and temple, etc., the public spaces, and about 100 acres are the residential tolas or blocks, uh, which are segregated by major caste groups of the village. The major segments in the village are the small and middle peasantry, who are mainly Gujars and Jats, but also now the old artisan caste of Kumhar and Muslims who have also taken to agriculture and commercial dairying lately. And then there are Dalits, two subcastes, Valmikis and Jatavs, who are both uh, farm and non-farm laborers, but also some are now uh, taking to the occupations of uh, artisans and service providers, etc. The population of the village when I came here first in 1989 for my first survey was about 2000, and according to the 2011 census of the village, of which I saw the unit level data, the numbers had grown to about 2,700. But in 2014, in my last comprehensive survey, I found the population to be around 2,600, which is a very interesting indicator of the fact that after a very long time, the village population has begun to shrink, largely because of two reasons. One, the falling birth rate and adoption of family planning by many families in the village, but also because of increasing migration to surrounding cities from Ghaziabad, Delhi, Meerut, etc. Now, the Vanshavali records maintained by the Bhats of the village show that till about 1780, the land was apparently uncultivated, although it's a very fertile land and has three ponds, as I said. And the first settlers were actually uh, some Gurjar herdsmen who had come from Ghaziabad. Later on, more Gurjar families settled in, and they were encouraged by the Zamidar of Todi, under whom this uncultivated land lay. They encouraged these settlers to take to cultivation along with cattle rearing, and that's how the village started growing. And as we all know, in 1803, the British, after defeating the Marathas at Surji Arjan Gaon, they took over this region and started the Mahalwadi settlement. And we see that the village became stable uh, from then on. Now, this raises a very interesting question. Given the fertility of this Doab tract, why was it uncultivated for such before 1780? And the villagers have some elders have an account for this. They say that during the 17th century, this was actually a prosperous village, but it was destroyed by the Delhi armies, and the villagers had apparently fled the tract at that time. And it is only after 1780 that we see uh, herdsmen, as I said, settling down and starting the village. Uh, I must mention that this village was earlier called Rasulpur Dhantala, after Sian of the Zamindar family called Rasul Baksh, whose grave is still there in the village. And he was particularly investing in the cultivation, growth of agriculture and cultivation in this tract. Uh, this also throws, forces us to actually develop a fresh perspective on the impact of colonial rule on India. Often we, of course, remember the colonial rule for deindustrialization and destruction of our crafts, of also heavy taxation and repressive land revenue settlements, etc. But the fact that a village like Dhantala in a very fertile tract became stable only after the coming of the British reminds us that this region was experiencing a lot of constant warfare and also, of course, attacks by the Western invaders. And it is the British rule that ended this streak of violence. And uh, also, from early 20th century, we see continuous growth in our population, both in India, and the same is reflected in the demographic record of Dhantala also. I could track the uh, population score in the Kacheri records for 1930, when it was mentioned as about 700. And obviously, the village has been growing continuously since then. And this is another thing which needs to be credited to the colonial administration, because the secular growth in population of the country is obviously unprecedented. India had never grown on a continuous basis before 20th century, and the obviously the role of railways in uh, uh, moving food grains across regions, the development of district hospitals, some modern medicine, etc., played a role in this significant improvement in life expectancy in the country, which, according to census records, rose from about 25 years to 33 years by 1947. Today, of course, we know the life expectancy average in the country is about 67 years. Now, let's have a brief look at the growth of amenities and infrastructure in Dhantala over the 2 centuries that we are discussing. The Under the colonial rule, apart from the decline in death rate, another important development was the building of Gang Nehar, which comes close, though not exactly, it doesn't touch Dhantala. And this is again a very important development for the region. Also, the British introduced the first tenancy protection laws. We Even our greatest monarchs like Ashoka and Akbar are not known for having introduced any security measures for Dalits or rural tenants, etc. Apart from some rent relief during famines and so on. This is another positive side of the British rule. Uh, Yet, on the whole, in 1947, Dhantala had neither any school, nor electricity, nor dispensary, nor any pakka road. Uh, and despite some improvement in death rate, the mortality was still very high. And there were one electric tube well had been installed in the village in 1935. This is the first electric tube well. And some brick wells had also been constructed, replacing the kacha rahets that were the mainstay of irrigation in earlier times. The first decade after independence saw a slew of major changes. Apart from introduction of universal franchise, we had abolition of zamindari, also introduction of land ceilings. In this region, the ceiling for individual holding is fixed at 18 acres for one holder. Also, the major reduction in tax, although reduction in tax had started under the Britishers themselves, this is another point which is often overlooked. And in fact, I saw for the rent and tax receipts of 1947 with one of the families of the village, and they suggest that about 15% of the gross produce was given as tax, which is obviously a big slide from Akbar's, for example, 33% demand over the gross produce. Uh, the first decade after independence also saw the construction of the first primary school, the installation of hand pumps. The first bicycle came to the village, and also the first radio, which was a very popular medium for catching up with news as well as songs in those times, and which it used to be uh, used collectively by villagers. In 1960s, Nehru's major effort to establish block development offices, uh, and for Dhantala, the block development office is at Kharkhoda, which is a small town at about 3 kilometers away from the village. The first Pakka road was built in 1960s on the outskirts of the village, and also the Pradhan, elected Pradhan rather than a nominated one, was also development of the 1960s. Also, the one major change was the arrival of HYVs, or high yielding variety of seeds, both wheat and rice. Sonhera Chausat is the wheat variety, which is still remembered by the village because immediately the yields almost doubled by after the coming of these seeds. In 1970s, the Green Revolution took off, and this led to further installation of tube wells, the use of fertilizers. Power supply also arrived in homes for the first time now, and this of course enabled villagers to start using fans and bulbs and so on. The first tractor came to the village in 1970s, and also the 20-point program of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi had one element called ICDS, the Integrated Child Development Scheme, which brought the appointment of ashas, or village nurses, and gave a big fillip to the vaccination program, thereby reducing infant mortality, especially in a major way. In 1980s, the White Revolution took off, and milk cooperative was established in the village, adding substantially to the agriculturist income. And also the first television sets came during this time, and villagers recall that the Ramayana serial was particularly a major reason for the purchase of first TV sets by the better off families in the village. And of course, programs were viewed collectively in those days. In 1984, a very important event happened in the village when all the landless they demonstrated at the Meerut collectorate and demanded that the 200 odd acres, which was the common land of the village, which was used for grazing, etc., should be distributed among all the landless. And this, after a long struggle for several months, in which the Communist Party unit of Meerut city, especially a leader called Satpal, uh, played a very important role, and the movement succeeded. Uh, in 1990s, two major developments took place, one in the economic field and the other in the political field. The liberalization of the economy, or rather the partial liberalization, which was introduced by Prime Minister Narasimha Rao, actually was expected to lead to greater poverty, especially by left economists. But quite the contrary seems to have happened, and there was a visible decline in poverty in 1990s for the first time. This was reflected in increasing construction of pakka houses instead of kacha houses, and also visibility of two-wheelers, etc., even in Dalit homes, which started during this period. What was the reason? Actually, liberalization helped in reduction of poverty by encouraging migration of landless workers from villages to cities. This in turn was encouraged by the expanding middle class in places like Gurgaon, Noida, etc., which liberalization spawned. And this middle class demanded services from villagers. And this in turn helped the rural farm wage to go up significantly. Today, the wage in Dhantala is about 400 rupees for unskilled worker. In 1989, I had noted the wage was rupees 20 per day. If we look at the inflation over the same period, we note more than doubling of the real wage over this time span. In saying in the decade after 2000, some major new amenities entered Dhantala again. Among these, satellite television, mobile phones, and a slew of welfare schemes like the employment guarantee scheme, the right to food, leading to much cheaper rations, right to education, bringing in a two. There are four middle schools actually now. Two are in private sector and two of the government schools. And after 2014, a very major improvement has come in the terms of regular power supply. Earlier, the village rarely had more than uh, 12 to 14 hours of electricity in a day. Now, the duration has improved to about 20 hours daily. And more than that, power supply is more reliable now. And if there are any snags, they are corrected more quickly rather than waiting for weeks, as was the norm earlier. Also, the large scale construction of toilets, houses, free distribution of gas cylinders, and also opening of bank accounts for most families. These have been the major improvements after 2014 with the coming of the Modi government. Still, the village lacks uh, water supply in homes, also uh, big lack of cold storage facilities which can prevent wastage of food crops, etc. And dispensary has opened only this week in the village, which is a very happy news, although it was pending for a long time. Now, this is the brief history of the growth of amenities in the village. Now, as I said, now we turn to the discussion of the social structure. And in this, I will be uh, running over the major groupings to come to class for a more detailed discussion. About village as a community, the only point I would like to make is that uh, the village rarely meets for its Gram Sabha also. Although village has a strong sense of identity, it has elected Panchayat and Pradhan now, but the Gram Sabha rarely meets, and that's a major lack. Uh, There's some snag with my. Screen is not. Can you see the slides?
No, sir. We can only see you right now.
I don't know what is the.
When you take your time, sir, I will remove this thing. Hmm. Now we can see the screen, but not you. Now both we can see.
Yeah. So we were talking.
Horizontal outlook would be better if you do.
Yeah. Sorry, I forgot. Regarding caste, I would just mention one major point which is often ignored is that overt discrimination has come down, but covert discrimination definitely remains. But this discrimination and hierarchy is uh, present also within Dalit caste. This point is often ignored. For example, Valmikis and Jatavs don't intermarry generally and don't vote uh, along similar lines. More significantly, they have a sense of hierarchy among themselves also. And Valmikis are seen as inferior by many Jatavs. Although, as I said, covert discrimination has come down. The village has about 15 odd Muslim families, but there has never been any violence along religious lines. But in surrounding cities as well as some villages, violence has been there. Uh, uh, Now we come to the category within social structure on which I wish to give some more time. What are the relations between classes in the village? And do they correspond to the Marxist uh, perspective on Indian social structure? See, the families in Dhantala can be clubbed into, as I said, uh, three broad classes, each of which has two layers. I've already described the absentee landlord uh, and rich peasants on the top, now joined by some formal sector employees and a rural bourgeoisie or professionals like lawyers, etc., as well as some shopkeepers who form the second layer within the elite of the village. The middle order of the village consists of peasants and artisans, uh, and there used to be the Jajmani relation between these two segments, whereby the artisans were attached to some landowning families, uh, uh, and they were paid, and this attachment was on a hereditary basis, and payment to the artisans for their services was generally in kind at the time of the harvest. This was the Jajmani system. And there used to be a considerable degree of loyalty between Jajmans and what were called Kamins or their uh, servicing families. Now, this Jajmani system has completely disappeared over time, especially from about 1980s when cash transactions grew, and also when in 1990s, as I said, migration of families from the village started. The Jajmani relations completely broke down. Also, the after the independence, I said tenants had become landowners with the abolition of zamindari, and the tax that they had to pay to the government also practically became negligible. In fact, the tax rate at the moment given to the state only by those who hold more than 15 acres of land is rupees 75 per acre per annum, which is a very, very small amount, as the average net earning from about 1 acre in good harvests, which are generally 2 to 3 harvests in a year, is about 50,000 to 1 lakh from 1 acre for a family. So, given that the tax rate is very low, the artisans are supposed to have declined in a big way under colonial rule. But actually, in Dhantala, we see that except for weavers, the decline of potters, carpenters, etc., was not dramatic at all. It has been a very slow process, and actually more so after independence. And in their place, however, lots of new service providers have now appeared, like drivers, etc., who commute daily to the cities, and even within the village, the repair shops for mobile phones, etc., are have emerged from the old artisan castes, especially which are Kumhars and Muslims. Uh, Among the lower order of the village, the laboring classes, farm and non-farm workers, again there has been a major change with the increase in rate of migration. The wages have risen considerably. As I said, they have roughly doubled in the last 30 years. Uh, Tirthankar Roy has in fact estimated that the real wage doubled in 200 years between 1750 and 1950, roughly. And now we are seeing the same rise in about 30 years. Especially this has, of course, as I said, happened after the liberalization of the economy. What about the relation between caste and class? There used to be a strong overlap till about 1970s between castes and classes. For example, on the top, there were no upper castes, of course. There was only one Brahmin family and one Banya family. The Brahmin family was actually very poor, and the Banya family didn't have much power in the village, and they could not retrieve their loans, and they also left. Uh, on the other hand, the absentee landlord were the Ashraf Muslims, and their agents were the rich Gurjars. The middle order of peasants and artisans were again OBC castes, or what we should better call middle castes, the Gurjars, Jats, Kumhars, and Muslims. And the lower order again had a very major overlap with the Dalit castes. But these overlaps have diminished considerably over time. And now, for example, Dalit families also own land, and some of them also are a part of the village elite of lawyers, teachers, etc., who have taken benefit of the reservation system, and also by their hard work in education, etc., they have been able to breach the barrier with the elites. And I personally saw even the upper caste now sit, for example, in meetings at the homes of the rich Dalit lawyer or the rich Dalit teacher, etc. So that has, and the last breach perhaps has been that now even upper castes are applying for sweepers jobs in the government sector. This is the perhaps the turnaround in the caste class relation. Some scholars have said that we should look at not classes within the village, but village itself as a class as against the city and the state. The advocates of this uh, proposition have been both politicians and scholars. Uh, Chaudhry Charan Singh, Mahinder Singh Tikat, Sharad Joshi of Maharashtra, and scholars like Gail Ombate and Yogendra Yadav recently have seemed to suggest this as the major division in Indian society, the city versus the village, or at least the farmers versus the state. Because within the village, the economic and political interests of the farmers and non-farmers do not overlap or coincide. Uh, but then even the farmers' movements against the state, as the one that is continuing at the moment around Delhi, also doesn't seem to have taken off in a big way because the interests of the rich peasants and the poor peasants don't coincide. The richer agricultural tracts like Punjab and Haryana, as opposed to poorer tracts like Bihar and Odisha, don't overlap. Also, farmers tend to have multiple identities, especially their caste and religious identities are also strong. Therefore, their mobilization as farmers primarily is not easy. Another reason is that the state is actually a major benefactor of the agriculturalists today. And the battle is only over the degree of subsidies that the farmers demand from the state. Uh, and the state is not extracting, like the pre-modern state, any surplus from the farmers. Uh, Rather, its failure to serve the farmer as a citizen lies in the fact that the infrastructure in villages is very poor, because the quality of public services is extremely poor, and rural industrialization has failed to take off, leading to major underemployment of farmers whose fields have shrunk, machines have entered in a big way, and mechanized agriculture doesn't demand that much of labor. So, most people in villages are extremely underemployed, and this is the failure of the state. Unfortunately, this failure has less been in focus in the farmers' demands, and more populist ones like greater price support for farm produce, etc., have dominated. Another reason why the battle between farmers and city seems not very sturdy is the fact that farmers' sons don't want to remain either in farming or in villages. They want to become city dwellers. So the war between farmers and state should cannot be seen as uh, uh, a long-lasting battle uh, or a very critical issue uh, in this light. So our evidence from Dhantala on class relations suggests that the Marxist perspective doesn't help us very far. Obviously, revolutionary class struggles have not developed, uh, but the bigger failure of Marxism in understanding rural social structure seems to lie in the fact that their understanding of the ruling class as well as the proletariat seems far from reality. There is no unified ruling class, and the interests of bureaucrats, for example, versus capitalists versus landowners are not only different but contradictory at times. So there is no single ruling class, rather, there are competing elites in the sense that Pareto suggested. Uh, Also, the Marxist perspective seems to have ignored the fact that the intelligentsia is a dominant partner in the ruling class. It's not just landowners and capitalists on whom they often dwell or target. But intelligentsia itself, the bureaucracy, the journalists, the academics, etc., are a major partner on the ruling class. Similarly, the dominant Marxist understanding of the have-nots or the proletariat also seems wanting in light of our research. The reason being that the Marxists often tended to focus on the industrial working class as the major component of the proletariat. But from the perspective of the small peasant and the petty vendor, who doesn't have any security, any pension, any medical benefit, etc., to fall back on, the industrial working class, which has jobs in the formal sector and therefore has some of these social security benefits and monthly wage, uh, they seem like some kind of a semi-elite to the informal sector worker. And this point needs emphasis in a setting like Indian village. Uh, Secondly, as I had said, even below the informal sector worker or laborer, there are the real have-nots of beggars, of the petty vendor, or who cannot go to sit even on the street but just remains confined to the entry of her house to sell petty uh, um, things, etc. So, this is the real underclass that cannot even labor because of health reasons or age X factor, etc., which should be seen as the real proletariat, unlike what Marxist analysts often seem to suggest. Another reason why Marxist perspective doesn't seem valid in light of our evidence is that obviously polarization is not happening. The state has introduced laws which has uh, made the economic life of the landless slightly better, and this introduction of ceilings on landholding, etc., has not allowed uh, the appropriation of petty holdings by richer farmers and so on. Obviously, there is little capitalist farming in villages, and it is the middle peasantry that dominates, including the fact that numerical dominance also plays a major role in economic as well as social security of concerned families. In this light, we see that class consciousness and conflicts have not risen to the extent that some, especially Maoists, etc., were expecting. But the incident of 1984 that I reported about the successful redistribution of land to the landless in Dhantala suggests that class consciousness remains a potential consciousness, and class conflicts are not entirely absent. Uh, but the biggest flaw in Marxism emerges from the fact that it looks at exploitation as its major concern rather than suffering in a broader sense. As I said, suffering arises from illness, from lack of literacy, from poor state of public services, etc., and pollution and contaminated food chain, etc. And these can be addressed only through better governance rather than revolutionary class struggles or creation of a classless society by itself. This raises a very interesting question. Why did Marxism attract such brilliant scholars and artists and activists, etc., all over the world, in fact? And several reasons can be suggested for this. Of course, Marxism's overt aim for standing for the downtrodden attracts intellect, obviously, but also the intellectual's passion for power and the Lenin's dreams of capturing power through not reform but revolution rising on the backdrop of a chaos uh, seems to have been a reason for many brilliant minds uh, having been attracted to Marxism. I must also mention at this point that Nobel laureates like Amartya Sen, who departed from Marxism to espouse welfareism, also are shown as limited in their perspective from our Dhantala evidence, uh, uh, especially by showing that Sanian welfareism, although has expanded the notion of development by linking it to capabilities, but its overwhelming stress has been on expansion of health infrastructure, education infrastructure, etc. Yet, just by increasing the number of teachers, improving their salaries, building more schools and classrooms, etc., in the absence of work discipline doesn't do any good. This has been a clear experience in uh, Dhantala, uh, because here, as I saw, even poor laborers are sending their children to private schools rather than the government school, which doesn't charge any fee and gives midday meal, free dress, etc. Yet they send them to private school where rupees 200 odd are taken per student per month, because the quality of teaching in the village school run by the government is extremely poor. So this aspect of governance reforms needs to be kept in mind. I've already explained the decline of Jajmani. About family, I would only like to mention that while joint kitchen and joint housing have declined, but the support between nuclear families belonging to same joint family continues in a major way, and even this extends to the fact that the gotra of or a collective of joint families doesn't allow marriage between youngsters belonging to same gotra. In fact, such alliances are can be even punished by the community by uh, ostracism and even by death at times. So this is taken very seriously in the village. Uh, about the position of women, I'll just mention that literacy, education of girls, etc., has improved in a big way. But the burden of work on village women is extreme, and from making dung cakes and cooking over mud chulas to fetching water in pitchers, etc. Even in rich families, better off families of Dhantala, women do most work, both uh, in domestic work, kitchen work, but also cattle rearing, etc. From morning to evening. Uh, However, positive on the positive side, female feticide has come down, and the sex ratio has improved visibly.
So, sir,
Uh,
let's take a
about the relation between the city and the village, I would like to say that not only has migration accelerated from Dhantala to cities, but daily commuting has grown in a big way. In 2014, I had counted that about 120, mainly men, were commuting daily from Dhantala. Uh, Also, for the first time, the village has started buying uh, professional services from the city. For example, in weddings, etc., the band, the decoration experts, etc., are hired by villagers also now. This is something new. About the state and the farmer, I've already dwelt a bit. Again, regarding poverty, I mentioned the significant decline occurring recently. But along with the decline in poverty, it is important to stress that some privations or daily sufferings have mounted in a big way, especially on the health front, with the growing contamination of soil, use of chemicals, etc., in the food chain, also falling water table, and even the rise of fake medicines and fake doctors are hurting the health environment. Also, the safety environment has suffered in a big way. Not only communal tensions have risen, but also crime had grown by leaps before 1914, especially under the Samajwadi government of Akhilesh Yadav, according to villagers. And this was one of the reasons they turned for the first time to vote for BJP in 2014. I would also like to mention here some, paradoxical decisions taken by the state, as for example, regarding farm suicides. P. Cyanite's work was, of course, much talked about, and it was shown that suicide rate has increased in the country from about 8 per lakh per annum to 11 by 2012. And the farm suicides, especially, were in news. But actually, when we look at the data more closely, the farmers' suicide rate is not higher than the national suicide rate. And also, I observed in Dhantala by examining about 20 suicide cases that the biggest reason for suicides is not poverty generally. In fact, we will recall that suicide rate is very high in countries like South Korea, in Japan, rather than states like Bihar or Odisha or Jharkhand. Suicide rate is lowest, in fact, in Bihar, whereas it is highest in Kerala, in Tamil Nadu, in Punjab, the richer states. So it has less to do with poverty, perhaps, than with other problems like use of drugs, etc., and family strife, and so on. So that this needs to be revisited. I observed in Dhantala too. Now, I have already explained my notion of culture, to which I turn now. In what ways has culture changed? As I said, the core of culture is the shared mentalities, which has 6 major segments: values, beliefs, loyalties, traits, emotions, and these are again at 3 levels: conscious, subconscious, and discrete consciousness, or what is known to the person but hidden from the world, from the outside. At all these levels, mentalities can be studied. Given the time constraint, I'll just focus on one aspect of consciousness or mentalities, that is political attitudes and perceptions and relations with the state. Uh, as I mentioned already, Dhantala was founded in 1780s at a time of immense political flux, when the Mughals were on the decline and Marathas and the Afghans were vying for supremacy in the region, while the British were entering as noble force. Uh, Also, this region saw for the first time popular rebellions which had never occurred in India before the 17th century. The Jat uprising, the Satpami uprising, among, of course, the others like the Sikh uprising. These were unprecedented rebellions against the uh, state by the ordinary villagers, not just rulers or fights between Rajputs and Sultans, etc., but peasants themselves rising. And surprisingly, when the British entered the region in 1803, their arrival was not resisted or at the popular level. And the takeover was rather swift and not very violent. Of course, in 1857, the uprising included masses and both peasants as well as urban workers. But the story of Dhantara shows that the supporters of the British were not in small numbers either. In fact, the Zamidar of Todi, who was the Zamidar of Dhantara also, his name was Yahya Khan at that time. And in fact, he lived for about 100 years till early 20th century. And his family mentions that they had received a request from Queen Victoria herself for supporting the English contingent of Meerut. And Yahya Khan therefore sided with the British rather than with the rebels. Uh, this may be slightly exaggerated, but it goes to show that though from some farmers had attacked Meerut English families residing in Meerut in 1857, but all villages clearly did not join this rebellion. The anti-colonial struggle grew in late 19th century, of course, and Meerut was a prime center for the rise of Arya Samaj, the Muslim associations, and so on. Tilak had also visited Meerut, and however, villagers don't seem to have joined this Swadeshi movement or the home rule movement uh, in any way. The coming of Gandhi, of course, changed the situation completely. And not only the national movement entered the villages, but the Meerut merchant, Raghuveer Narayan Singh, who was a major follower of Gandhi, his processions received major welcome in village like Dhantala also. But active supporters of the national movement, even under Gandhi, were very few. In Dhantala, for example, there was one youngster called Soni Sunar, who was in fact expelled by his own family for siding with the Gandhians. Another limitation of the Gandhian movement, despite its, of course, unprecedented success, and as I said, for the first time reaching the villages, but on the debit side, the not only active supporters were few in villages, but also it had competition from Muslim separatism in some quarters, as well as followers of Netaji, the revolutionaries like Bhagat Singh, etc., who were critics of Gandhi. And from Dhantala, there was one soldier called Fakira who had joined the INA under Subhash Bose. Because of him, Subhash Bose seems always in competition with popularity of Gandhi. Yet when Gandhi was assassinated on 30th January 48, the villagers recall no one cooked any meal in the village, which shows of course, the silent popularity of Gandhi for villagers too. Now let's look at the electoral politics after independence. Congress remained hegemonic, and Mohsina Kidwai, for example, was elected MP for several times from Meerut. Uh, but this hegemony uh, was partly uh, uh, developed because of the flight of Ashrafs or many Muslim leaguers to Pakistan from the region. The major challenge then came from leaders like Charan Singh, etc. In 1967, in 1977, dent was made in Congress hold on the electoral politics, but real marginalization of Congress as on a long-term basis began only with 1989, when SP, BSP, and BJP started competing for the votes in the region at the expense of the Congress. And of course, 2014 should be till 2014. Dhantala had never voted for BJP in any notable way, but 2014 was a major turnaround, and BJP has been firmly in the saddle since then, securing up to 40% of the total vote uh, in different types of elections, from district, village panchayat to the Lok Sabha, etc. Now, what is the cause for this disenchantment with what are called secular parties and the turn towards BJP in a village like Dhantala, which had never supported RSS, etc. Although the Ram Mandir movement, of course, created a big ripple here too. Uh, the villagers themselves claim that it is not because of what is called Hindu polarization or any communal prejudice against Muslims. They say that they are now voting for BJP because of their disenchantment with what was called secular appeasement of some Muslim demands, and also because the level of corruption, inflation, etc., pinched them very hard before 2014. On the other hand, the implementation of some policies like construction of toilets, etc., has been appreciated by villagers. Uh, among other long-term shifts in political consciousness, we can, of course, point out increased political awareness. Most people now know not only political parties' names and their symbols, but also candidates' names. Although there are major differences between gender and age groups in this regard. Another notable feature is uh, rising criticism of dynasticism and loosening hold of caste in electoral politics. Although caste remains a major factor, but it is subcaste and not varnas which vote together. This is something which needs to be underlined against prominent discourses in media, etc., which talk of, for example, Dalit vote. There is no Dalit vote in villages like Dhantala. There is Jata vote and there is Valmiki vote, which go differently. And even when we talk about Jata vote or Muslim vote, it is rarely more than 50 or 60% of the total segment that votes together for a party. There are other factional loyalties, there are economic interests, there is preference or liking for a leader of which lead to differential voting even within these segments. We can here raise another interesting question: why has the left party failed, despite having strong trade union movement? And in case of Dhantala, for example, I mentioned that it was a communist leader called Satpal who had helped in a major way in the success of the distribution of land to the landless. Despite this, communists don't get any vote from Dhantala and have never won more than a couple of seats in entire Western Uttar Pradesh. What could be the reason? Uh, I think one reason is their stress on uh, the politics of the proletariat, which clashes in a major way with the politics of the farmer, who's the landowner. Secondly, their open anti-religion stand, also sometimes anti-national stands taken, for example, at the time of the Chinese aggression in 1962, etc., are recognized by the villagers also, at least those who are literate and read papers, newspapers, etc., uh, for reasons for having no appeal of the left in the region. As I mentioned, also the fact that the left's very understanding of the rural social structure seems flawed, both at the level of understanding the ruling class as well as the proletariat, as mentioned before. I've mentioned how the schools in Dhantala have performed. Lastly, let me just mention what are the major theoretical implications of our findings from Dhantala. See, first of all, we can see that the process of change is neither revolutionary nor cataclysmic. Neither has been there any breakdown, nor any major sudden transformation. Although some radical measures were introduced by the state, like abolition of zamindari, for example, like attacks on patriarchy through new laws, uh, also the introduction of reservations for Dalits in jobs and education, etc. These were radical measures different from the traditional social setup and social values of Dhantala. But in India as a whole, and as illustrated in this village also, the tendency has been to adapt to changes rather than sudden breakdown. Among the institutions that have been transforming in the biggest way are the state itself, the democratic politics and constitution of India, the role of political parties and ideologies, and besides this, schooling and the introduction of new media. Uh, among the uh, customs and institutions that are persisting and changing at a slowest pace are religion, family, and aspects of beliefs and values. The institutions that have adapted in a big way without any major mutation are caste and the village community. The broad patterns in this dual of change and continuity in village social and cultural structures, we can identify major patterns as revivalism versus modernization, globalization and westernization, also non-Western global influences in cuisine, in religious organization, alternative models of social justice as coming from China, etc. These are broader at the broader level for the country as a whole, competing patterns in social and cultural change. It is evident that some of these tendencies have major contradictions. For example, rationality versus the traditional stress on customs and community, etc. Democracy versus hierarchy, which is traditionally entrenched through caste and family, gender, etc. These are there are serious clashes, obviously, in these cultural trends. Uh, these also result in ambiguities, flux, and uh, inconsistencies in lifestyles and value systems. One major example of a very contrasting Western value of privacy, for example, has slowly emerged now in Dhantala and is reflected in the fact that private bedrooms for young couples are now being built in houses, which was not the case in traditional housing. Uh, Another major and very contradictory values are reflected in modern entertainment, especially that which is available on satellite channels and mobile phones now, which clashes completely with the traditional values. And there is amalgam as well as confusion around these contrasting values and slow changes in, for example, the attire of girls in the village now and discontinuation of dupatta, not by all girls, but some girls increasingly, is reflected in these cultural changes. My study has, as I said, questioned some theoretical perspectives, especially the nationalist critique of colonial regime on some angles, not all, of course, and especially the Marxist understanding of rural class structure. But besides Marxism, my study also points to and challenges determinist ideas and economistic understandings of change and values a lot, places a lot of value on understanding culture to be able to grasp the uh, uh, story of cultural change in any community. This is closer to the Weberian perspective rather than postmodern or Marxist perspective, and calls for long term comparative studies of culture and history through thematic history rather than national history all the time. Uh, but above all, my study appeals for clarity, brevity, reflexivity, rather than jargon and ideological correctness. With this, I conclude my talk, but I must, yeah, I have some suggested readings for those who may be interested, which I'll submit to the Teaching Learning Center. These are on concepts and methodology. Then there are some on rural histories and sociologies. And there are some web links I'll give for very interesting lectures by Chomsky, etc., which enrich our theoretical understandings. And from my own field research, there are some writings which I have listed in the readings. I also want to acknowledge my assistants in fieldwork. Unfortunately, I don't have Vikas's photograph here, but Vikas himself was very helpful and one of the best uh, researchers who helped me in collecting data from Dhantala. This is an major door-to-door survey I did for the occupations in Dhantala over time and how they have changed, which can be of interest to some readers. So I conclude, and I hope I have provoked you enough to present some questions and challenges and criticisms. Thank you for listening.